Hi, this is Joe Barbieri with the New City Library Reference Department, and this is History Bits, a video segment where we take a few minutes to discuss an aspect of Rockland County history. Today we're going to talk about some of the old and forgotten place names in Rockland County. Some of these aren't completely forgotten. They are remembered in street names, monument names. A lot of them are just a lot of the old family names that have been around for a long time, so some of these are still here in some way, shape, or form. Some important things to remember that we're going to keep in mind while we're going to do this video is that unlike today, we don't have modern street names and boundaries for our hamlets and villages. And some of these places that we're going to talk about weren't necessarily always very densely inhabited. Sometimes they were just the place of a particular business, or they were just describing an intersection between two roads. And a lot of them, they kind of got swallowed up into the hamlets and villages as they grew and developed. The other thing to keep in mind is this list is not exhaustive. There are many, many places in Rockland County that have alternate or different names or were called different things over the years. This is just a small sampling from that. To help us out today, we're going to be using two different maps, mostly from the 1854 and sometimes the 1876 maps of the county. And we're also going to be using some modern satellite images just to help us kind of orient ourselves. All right, so let's begin. Okay, so we are going to begin at the northernmost portion of the county, and the first place we're going to talk about is Doodletown. And this was a settlement that pretty much dried up when the Palisades Interstate Parkway acquired the land up there. It's just across the Orange County border from Bear Mountain. And basically in the 1920s, they started buying up the land, and more or less it's kind of a modern ghost town today. If you're up at Bear Mountain, you can hike around there today. The second one that we're going to look at right up there is Iona Island, which was also known as Wyant's Island. George Wyant was the owner in prior to the middle of the 19th century. Here on the 1854 map, we only see the bottom portion, Round Island, labeled. That's still what it's known as today. But if you look just above the little box there that I've highlighted, you can see that the Wyant heirs still own one of the properties up there. So Wyant's Island, an old name for Iona Island. Next, we're going to move a little bit further south, and we're going to look at a little place called Antioch, and other times it's known as Beebs Mill for Henry Beebe, who ran a mill here in the 1830s. This is just a little bit west of the village of Stony Point, and as it grew, it basically became absorbed into it. You can see there's lots of members of the Beebe family with properties around here, so that's pretty much why it was called Beebs Mill. Up next we have Flores Falls, and this is, or sometimes known as Flora Falls. This is basically, it comes from Flores Crum, who originally owned the property back in colonial times, and historian Frank Bertang Green in the 1880s, he notes that there's this pretty little cascade that falls by the creek in the schoolhouse. And eventually this becomes, I guess because it sounds prettier, it was corrupted into Flora Falls, like it's here on the map. So sometimes it's called Flores Falls, other times Flora Falls, but tiny little waterfall there, cascade, that's right by the schoolhouse up there. Okay, so we're going to keep working our way a little further south down the county, and we're going to go over a little bit to the west, and we're going to talk about Gurney's Corner. And this was the name for Mount Ivy, and it was named after property owner W.F. Gurney. And as you can see on the map here, we have several Gurneys who lived in the area in the 1850s on the 1854 map. But you also have to know that sometimes this isn't just, it wasn't because these folks were very prominent. In his 1880s history, Frank Bertang Green says that, quote, like many other places in the county called corners, with the prefix of the nearest resident property owner to designate the locality, this spot calls for no special attention. So, end quote there. So Green doesn't really think too much of the Gurney family, so apologies to them. Next, we're going to jump back towards the river, and we're going to look at Warren, which of course is the original name for the village of Haverstraw when it incorporated. It was incorporated as Warren in 1854, so our map here reflects that. And then it was officially renamed to Havistraw 20 years later in 1874. And right nearby, we had Sampsondale. And this is one of the old names for what we'd pretty much call West Havistraw today. Elisha Peck was a Massachusetts-born merchant and industrialist who went into business in England, and he returned back to the U.S., and he starts a metal rolling plant where they roll big sheets of metal into standardized sized pieces. And that was in the 1830s. And the ship, when he came back to the U.S., was called Sampson. So he called this factory, and the little town that springs around it is known as Sampsondale. Moving just to the south of Havistraw, or as now we know was one time Warren, we have Snedeker's Landing. And Tunis M. Snedeker and George W. Snedeker started a shipyard here in 1845. As other landings and shipyards were built along the water, its importance diminished by the end of the 1800s. Sometimes this was also called Waldburg Landing because of its proximity to Waldburg, which we're going to discuss in a few minutes. And today this is pretty much where we'd find Tilcon and the Dutchtown neighborhood of Havistraw in modern times. Next, we're going to make a jump westward, and we're going to look at Mechanicsville, and that was the old name for Viola. And they had to change the name because there was already a Mechanicsville in Saratoga County. So they called it Viola starting in the 1880s, and it's said to have been taken from a child born, and they thought it was a pretty name, and her name was Viola at the county almshouse. And the county almshouse was, of course, the administrative building for Rockland Community College. So that's smack dab in the middle of Viola today. A little bit north of Viola, we have Sherwoodville, and that's basically the name for the area surrounding where the Wesley Chapel is today, and that's because Reverend James Sherwood was the first superintendent of the Wesley Chapel. And we're going to move back over to the eastern portion of the county to Cedar Grove Corners, or Waldburg. These were early names for Congers. In the 1830s, a church was built here, but there was that nearby grove of cedar trees that took center stage when it came to naming this place. Later in the 1800s, A.B. Conger buys the tract of land around there, and he calls the estate Waldburg. And the neighborhood that builds up around it takes that name. So today, Cedar Grove Corners is right at the intersection between Old Havistraw Road and Congers Road, and the church was originally Presbyterian, but since the 1870s, it's been a Methodist church. Next, we have Strawtown. So we're a little bit to the west of where we just were, and that was actually just to the east of New City, and now to the west of Lake DeForest. There was no Lake DeForest there at the time, and it's more or less what was sandwiched between Brewery and Strawtown roads today. South of Strawtown, we have Barden Station, an early name for Bardonia, and they are named for the German immigrant John Barden, who settled there in the 1860s, and his family had a store, and the surrounding area takes the name of Bardonia. A little bit before this, this area nearby was called Mosestown. In the 1880s, it was described as being very, very rural, so I think this has probably just got absorbed into what we'd call Bardonia today. Next, we're going to go to Oblinus' Corners, and this is where the Clarksville Inn is located today. And that's where West Nyack Road meets Strawtown Road. And this intersection here is made when the Nyack Turnpike comes in the late 1820s. Until the late 1840s, this was known as Oblinus' Corners for the prominent Dutch family that lived there for several years and ran the post office there for a little while. It sounds like an Irish name if you ask me at first, but apparently there was a Van Oblinus was the original name of the family there. In the late 1840s, the people in the neighborhood get together and they kind of decide to call this chunk of town Clarksville. Maybe they think this sounds more distinctive. Clarkstown had been the name in use for the town for about 50 years or so, so I think maybe they liked that a little bit more and thought it described the area a little bit better. So while we're nearby, we're going to talk about West Nyack. Clarksville is one of the older names for West Nyack, but originally West Nyack is what we would call today Central Nyack. This name change occurred because in the 1880s, the area that we currently know as West Nyack, or Clarksville, sometimes they even referred to it as Mount Moore. But the West Shore Railroad had come in, and they wanted to increase their clout and make it at least seem like they served Nyack, which was the important commercial center of the time. The New York Central was headed by the Vanderbilt family, who used their influence to help make this change happen. And thus, West Nyack becomes Central Nyack that we know today. And Clarksville and Mount Moore are now West Nyack, with the station that is serviced by the West Shore Railroad. The Mount Moore name is still alive in the cemetery that's located on the grounds of the Palisades Shopping Center. So this portion, special thanks to Heritage of West Nyack website, which you can find at www.heritageofwestnyack.org for all the information on the background of the West Shore Railroad. Next, we're going to go back towards the center of the county, and we're going to look at the Dutch factory, which is southeast of Spring Valley. And beginning in 1812, there was a factory here, and it made different things over different periods of time. It burned down and was rebuilt several times, but basically over the years they produced yarn, blankets, candle wicks, mosquito netting, and fabric for hats here over the years. So this was one of the center of industrial production here in the county, and it was aptly named the Dutch Factory. Next, we're going to move a little further south, and we're going to talk about one of the many names for Pearl River. So it went by Middletown, and also it was also described as the muddy brook that ran through it at the bottom of the valley there. Sometimes it was also known as Norrichon, which is kind of the southeastern portion of it today, and that was also described as a place called Orangeville as well. The first settlements in Pearl River were along the high ground near Middletown Road, not where we would think of as probably more downtown Pearl River today, near the flood-prone Muddy Brook. Stories about the Pearl River name vary a little bit, but it's likely that in the industrialist Julius Bronsdorf, whose factories helped build up Pearl River, the business district there, kind of what we know today, in the 19th century. It is said that Bronsdorf complained that he didn't like the name of the station that the New Jersey and New York Railroad had called it there. They called it Muddy Brook. And Mrs. John Demarest, who is the railroad president's wife, selected the name of Pearl River after the freshwater pearl producing mussels that could be found in the brook at this time. So that's the story. That's probably how it got the name there, and that's special thanks to Jim Cassetta's book Pearl River from Arcadia Press in the Images of America series on the history of early Pearl River. So like I mentioned before, there were these other little sections of Pearl River too. We have Orangeville and Norrichon, and those are closer to where we find the Blue Hill Golf Course today. Of course, the topography at the time was a lot different. The Hackensack Water Company had not yet dammed up the Hackensack River yet. This happens in the 1960s. So when they flood the area and create those big reservoirs there, things look a lot different nowadays. Right next to Pearl River, we have the area that was once known as South Spring Valley, and of course, when this area is incorporated, it gets the name of Chestnut Ridge, and that incorporation takes place in 1986, so that's a relatively recent change. Now we're going to move back over to the eastern portion section of the county again, and we're going to look at Greenbush, and that's the old name for Blauvelt. And that comes from the name of Judge Cornelius Blauvelt. He was a prominent citizen there. He was postmaster for several years and a prominent figure in local politics. If we look at the 1854 map here, we're going to notice that it calls it Blauveltville. But up towards the right-hand side of the portion of the map, there still is a section called Greenbush. And that was one of the original names there for it. And this actually coincides where we find the modern Greenbush Road there today. And next we have, working our way down and right on the water there, on the Hudson, we have the Tappan Sloat. And this was the old name for Piermont. After the Erie Railroad comes in 1839 and the pier was built, we get the Piermont name. Actually, for some years between the 1840s and 1870s, what we would call Spark Hill now was just known as Upper Piermont. And next we have New Antrim, which was the old name for Suffern, and that's what its founder, John Suffern, called it after his hometown in Northern Ireland. It was officially named Suffern in his honor in 1841, a few years after he died. It was also known as the Point of the Mountain, and that's because it was kind of the transportation hub where the railroads and the Nyack Turnpike would pass through, so people would call it the Point of the Mountain because of that. Next, we have the case of Woodburn, which was the old name for Hilburn, and this one's a lot like Viola. In the 1880s, they were asking the state for a post office, and they realized, oh, there is a Woodbourne in Sullivan County, so that sounds a lot like Woodburn. So to avoid confusion, the residents there select Hilburn instead. And finally, we're going to go up to the very top portion and the northwesternmost portion of the county, and we're going to look at Sloatsburg. And we have a couple old names for this. This was known as Pleasant Valley, and also it was known as Dader's Works. Dader being another person who had an iron refining business near the upper portion of Sloatsburg in the 1800s. The current names, of course, comes from the prominent Sloat family that ran the sawmill, tannery, and cotton mill there for many years. And special thanks to www.sloatsburgny.com for this background information. I hope you've enjoyed this little trip around the county. Like I said in the beginning, this wasn't an exhaustive list, but hopefully you learned something today. Signing off for the New City Library Reference Department, this is Joe Barbieri. We'll see you next time.